The idea came to Dr. Elena Mercer on a rainy Tuesday afternoon as she sat in her office at the Thanatology Research Institute. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind, their shadows dancing across her desk. She had been studying near-death experiences for over 15 years, collecting thousands of accounts from people who had briefly crossed over before being pulled back to life. But something was missing: hard evidence. Elena tapped her pen against her notepad, her mind racing. What happens in those first crucial days after death when the body is sealed away from the world? The question had haunted her for years. Medical science understood the biological processes of decomposition, but Elena suspected there was more, something that couldn't be observed in a sterile lab environment. She stood up suddenly, her chair rolling back and hitting the wall. That was it. What if they could observe in real time what happens inside a coffin after burial? The next morning, Elena gathered her small team in the conference room. Peter Chen, her research partner of 10 years, was the first to arrive, followed by Diane Reynolds, their neurological expert, and Thomas Green, the youngest member who specialized in advanced imaging technology. "I know how this is going to sound," Elena began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But I want to put monitoring equipment inside a coffin during an actual burial." The silence that followed was deafening. Peter raised his eyebrows, a habit he had when he thought Elena was pushing boundaries too far. "You want to spy on the dead?" Diane asked finally, leaning forward. "Not spy," Elena corrected, spreading her hands on the table. "Observe. Document. For science." She turned to the screen behind her and pulled up a presentation she had stayed up all night preparing. "Think about it. We know what happens to bodies in controlled environments, but an actual burial combines psychological, spiritual, and physical elements we can't recreate in a lab." Thomas, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "What exactly would we be looking for?" Elena smiled, grateful for the question. "Changes in temperature and humidity, of course, but also electromagnetic readings, sound, and light variations. Essentially, any measurable phenomena that occurs in those first 72 hours. Peter shook his head. "The ethics committee will shut this down before you finish the proposal." "Not if we do it right," Elena countered. "We'll only use volunteers who have given explicit consent before death, and family approval would be mandatory." She looked at each of them in turn. "This could change everything we think we know about what happens after death." The team debated for hours. By lunchtime, even Peter had reluctantly agreed to help draft the proposal, though he remained skeptical that it would ever be approved. Against all expectations, 2 months later, the ethics committee gave their conditional approval. The restrictions were extensive. Only terminal patients who had signed detailed consent forms could participate. Families had final veto power, and all equipment had to be non-invasive and removable without disturbing the remains. Finding willing participants proved challenging. Most people, even those facing death, were uncomfortable with the idea of cameras monitoring their final resting place. Elena had almost given up hope when her office phone rang on a quiet Friday afternoon. "Is this Dr. Mercer? The one doing the coffin study?" The voice on the other end was weak but determined. "Yes, this is she," Elena replied, sitting up straighter. "My name is Thomas Whitfield. I'm a physicist with the University Research Department. Or I was, until pancreatic cancer decided my career was over." He paused, catching his breath. "I want to volunteer for your study." Elena met Thomas the following day at his home. Despite his frail appearance, his eyes sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. He sat in a worn armchair surrounded by books and scientific journals, an oxygen tank beside him. "Why do you want to do this?" Elena asked after explaining the details of the study. Thomas smiled faintly. "I've spent my life studying the fundamental forces of the universe: gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces." He gestured to his withered body. "Now I'm experiencing the most fundamental transition of all, and I find myself intensely curious about what happens next." He leaned forward, his voice growing stronger. People fear death because it's unknown. If your research sheds even the slightest light on what happens afterward, wouldn't that be worth it? Elena found herself nodding. Your family? My wife passed 3 years ago, Thomas interrupted. My daughter lives overseas. She thinks the idea is strange but supports my decision. She knows I've always been a bit odd. He chuckled, which turned into a cough. When he recovered, he fixed Elena with an intense gaze. So, when do we start? Over the next few weeks, Elena's team designed a specialized monitoring system that could be discreetly placed in Thomas's coffin. The setup included heat and motion sensors, electromagnetic field detectors, microphones sensitive enough to pick up the slightest vibration, and small cameras equipped with infrared capability. Everything was designed to run on long-lasting batteries and store data locally. Thomas declined rapidly during this time but remained engaged in the project, even suggesting modifications to the equipment. Make sure the EM field sensor can detect very low frequencies, he insisted during one of their meetings. When Elena asked why, he simply smiled mysteriously and said, "Just a hunch." On a cold morning in late October, Elena received the call. She had been both expecting and dreading. Thomas had passed peacefully in his sleep. His daughter Claire had arrived from overseas just in time to say goodbye. 3 days later, Elena and her team attended Thomas's funeral. It was a small affair, with just a handful of colleagues from his university days and a few neighbors. Claire had honored her father's wishes, allowing the research team to install their equipment before the service. As Thomas's coffin was lowered into the ground, Elena felt a strange mix of sadness and scientific anticipation. She had grown fond of the old physicist with his sharp mind and dry humor. Now he was making his final contribution to science. Back at the institute, a dedicated computer system began receiving data from the sensors in Thomas's coffin. For the first 24 hours, everything proceeded as expected. Gradual temperature changes, normal settling sounds as the soil compacted above the burial site. On the second day, Peter rushed into Elena's office, his face pale. "You need to see this," he said, leading her to the monitoring room. On the screen, unusual electromagnetic readings pulsed in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic. The temperature sensors showed inexplicable cold spots that moved around the coffin. Most striking were the audio recordings, faint vibrations at frequencies just below normal human hearing that, when analyzed and enhanced, appeared to have distinct patterns. "Equipment malfunction," Elena suggested, though her heart raced with other possibilities. Peter shook his head. "We've triple-checked everything. These readings are real." For the next 48 hours, the team worked around the clock, analyzing the increasingly bizarre data coming from Thomas's grave. The patterns grew stronger, more defined, especially during the night hours. "It's almost like..." Thomas began one evening, staring at the screen. "Like what?" Elena prompted. "Like he's trying to tell us something," he whispered. On the 5th day, Claire visited the institute to see the results of her father's final experiment. Elena had prepared her for the unusual nature of their findings, but was still nervous about sharing them. "My father would have loved this," Claire said after reviewing the data. She didn't seem surprised or disturbed by the strange readings. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a worn journal. "He left this for you. Said you should open it after you've collected 5 days of data." Elena accepted the journal, with trembling hands. Inside, Thomas had documented his own theories about consciousness after death, written during his final months. On the last page, dated just 1 week before his passing, he had written, "Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. Why should consciousness be any different? The answers are there if we know how to look, and now perhaps we finally will." As Elena closed the journal, a notification pinged on the computer. New data was coming in from the gravesite, stronger and clearer than anything they had recorded so far. The team gathered around the screen, watching in stunned silence as the patterns evolved into something none of them had expected. The experiment that had begun as a scientific curiosity was about to change everything they thought they knew about life, death, and what might lie beyond. And somewhere, Elena was certain, Thomas Whitfield was watching with satisfaction as his final hypothesis began to unfold. 3 days after Thomas Whitfield's funeral, Elena and her team gathered in the lab, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep. None of them had gone home since the strange readings began. The tiny break room with its lumpy couch and humming vending machine had become their temporary home. "Okay, let's review what we have so far," Elena said, standing before the wall of screens displaying the data. Her usual neat appearance had given way to wrinkled clothes and messy hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. Peter rubbed his tired eyes. Temperature fluctuations that don't match any known pattern of decomposition. Cold spots that seem to move around the coffin like they have a mind of their own. And the electromagnetic readings, Diane added, pointing to a graph on her tablet. "They're not random. Look at this pattern. It repeats every 4 hours, almost to the second." Thomas Green, the imaging specialist, had been unusually quiet. He sat hunched over his computer, replaying the infrared footage from inside the coffin. "You need to see this," he said suddenly, his voice tight. The team gathered around his screen. At first glance, the footage showed nothing unusual, just the still form of Thomas Whitfield lying peacefully in his coffin. But as they watched, faint wisps of light appeared to move across the body, like gentle waves on a calm sea. "What are we looking at?" Peter asked, leaning closer. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "It's not a camera malfunction. I've checked everything, 3 times. These light patterns shouldn't exist in a sealed, dark environment." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "What about the audio recordings?" Diane pulled up the sound files on the main screen. "We've been picking up vibrations at frequencies just below normal human hearing. When I ran them through our analysis software and adjusted the pitch," she pressed a button and the room filled with a strange rhythmic sound. "It almost sounds like," Peter began. "Like words," Elena finished, barely above a whisper. The team looked at each other, the weight of what they might be discovering settling over them. Whatever was happening inside Thomas Whitfield's coffin defied conventional explanation. "We need to expand the study," Elena said finally. "One case isn't enough to draw conclusions. We need more data points." "Who's going to volunteer after we tell them about this?" Peter gestured at the screens. "Hey, want to put cameras in your coffin? We might record your ghost." Elena frowned at him. "We're scientists, not ghost hunters. There's obviously something happening that we don't understand yet. But that doesn't mean we're jumping to supernatural explanations." She turned to Diane. "What does the neurological data show?" Before Thomas's death, they had recorded his brain activity as a baseline. Diane pulled up the files and displayed them alongside the electromagnetic readings from the coffin. The room went silent. "That can't be possible," Peter whispered. "The patterns matched." "Not exactly, but close enough that it couldn't be coincidence." The electromagnetic pulses coming from Thomas's coffin resembled his brainwave patterns from when he was alive. "We need to go public with this," Thomas Green said. "Absolutely not," Elena replied firmly. "Not yet. We need more data, more cases, and we need to rule out every possible conventional explanation first. But science rarely stays contained in its neat little box." The next morning, Elena arrived at the institute to find a small crowd of reporters gathered at the entrance. Someone had leaked preliminary findings. "Dr. Mercer, is it true your team has recorded evidence of life after death?" a reporter called out as Elena tried to push through the crowd. "No comment at this time," she said, heart pounding. This was exactly what she had wanted to avoid, sensationalism before they had solid answers. Inside, she found her team looking guilty. "Who talked?" she demanded. They all shook their heads, but Peter stepped forward. "It wasn't us, Elena, but I think I know who it might have been." He handed her his tablet displaying an email from Claire Whitfield. Thomas's daughter had shared some of their findings with a friend who worked for a science blog. From there, it had spread like wildfire. Elena spent the day fielding calls from colleagues, journalists, and even religious leaders, all wanting to know about the coffin experiment. By evening, the story had gone viral, with headlines ranging from "Scientists Discover Proof of Afterlife" to "Bizarre Energy Patterns Recorded in Grave." "This is a disaster," Elena told her team as they huddled in her office, avoiding the reporters, still camped outside. "We're nowhere near ready to present findings." "Maybe it's not such a bad thing," Thomas Green suggested. "Think about it. Now we'll have plenty of volunteers." He was right. By the end of the week, the Institute had received over 300 emails from terminally ill patients volunteering for the study. The Ethics Committee, initially alarmed by the publicity, grudgingly approved an expansion of the research with additional oversight. Over the next 2 months, 5 more subjects joined the study. Each volunteer was in the final stages of terminal illness, each fascinated by what might happen after they were gone. Elena spent hours with each of them, explaining the research and listening to their stories. There was John, a retired teacher with late-stage lung cancer who wanted to contribute to the great mystery. Maria, a young mother with an aggressive brain tumor who hoped the research might someday help her children understand death better. Robert, William, and Lena, all facing the end with a courage that humbled Elena. As each volunteer passed away and was buried with the monitoring equipment in place, the team held their breath. Would they show the same strange patterns as Thomas Whitfield? The answer came quickly and definitively. Yes. Each coffin produced similar readings: temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic pulses, light patterns, and those strange, almost language, sounds. There were variations, of course. Maria's electromagnetic readings were faster, more energetic. Robert's were steady and methodical, but the basic phenomena appeared in all cases. Most striking was the correlation between the subjects' recorded brain waves and the electromagnetic patterns after death. The match wasn't perfect, but it was consistent enough to be statistically significant. The scientific community split into camps. Some dismissed the findings outright, suggesting equipment malfunction or deliberate fraud. Others proposed conventional explanations: chemical reactions in decomposing bodies, battery issues with the equipment, or even subtle earth tremors affecting the readings. But a growing number of scientists began to consider more radical hypotheses. What if consciousness didn't end at death but transformed into a different type of energy? What if Thomas Whitfield's hunch had been right all along? 6 weeks after the expansion of the study, Elena received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Lawrence. Chen was a quantum physicist from MIT who had been following their research with interest. "Your findings align with some theoretical work I've been doing," he told Elena as they sat in her office. "Quantum theory suggests consciousness might be fundamentally connected to the universe at the subatomic level. What if death isn't an ending, but a transition to a different state of quantum coherence?" Elena found herself drawn into hours of discussion with Dr. Chen, whose theories provided a potential framework for what they were observing. By the end of his visit, they had agreed to collaborate, merging their research teams. That night, alone in her apartment, Elena pulled out Thomas Whitfield's journal again. She turned to a page she had read many times now. "We think of death as an ending, but the universe doesn't work that way. Energy transforms. Matter transforms. Why not consciousness? Perhaps what we call death is merely a phase transition, like water turning to vapor. Still the same essence, just in a form we can no longer easily perceive." Outside her window, the night sky was filled with stars. Elena thought about how those distant pinpoints of light were actually massive balls of energy, transforming matter into radiation that traveled across the universe. Beginnings and endings, all part of the same cosmic dance. She picked up her phone and texted her team, "Meeting tomorrow, 8 a.m., bring coffee. We've got work to do." Something profound was happening in those coffins, something that might change humanity's understanding of life and death forever. And Elena Mercer was determined to find out what it was. Word spread quickly through scientific circles and beyond. What had begun as Elena's quiet research project was now the subject of heated debate in universities, religious institutions, and dinner tables around the world. The Coffin experiment, as it had been dubbed by the media, had captured the public imagination in ways Elena had never anticipated. 3 months into the expanded study, Elena found herself standing before a packed auditorium at the International Conference on Consciousness Studies. Hundreds of faces looked back at her, fellow scientists, religious scholars, journalists, and curious members of the public. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her shoulders. "What we've discovered," Elena began, her voice steady, despite her nerves, "challenges our fundamental understanding of what happens after clinical death." Behind her, screens displayed the data they had collected from all 6 subjects. The patterns were unmistakable, electromagnetic readings that mirrored the brain activity of the deceased while they were alive, temperature fluctuations that defied normal decomposition processes, and those strange light patterns that seemed to move with purpose. "We are not making claims about the afterlife or the soul," Elena continued, choosing her words carefully. "As scientists, we deal in measurable phenomena, not spiritual interpretations. What we can say with confidence is that something continues, after what we traditionally define as death, some form of energy that retains patterns unique to the individual." The questions afterward came rapid fire. Some colleagues suggested alternative explanations: bacterial activity generating electromagnetic fields, equipment contamination, even deliberate fraud. Elena addressed each concern methodically, explaining their control measures and inviting independent verification of their methods. As the conference continued over the next 3 days, Elena noticed the scientific community beginning to split. Many dismissed their findings outright, unwilling to consider implications that threatened materialist views of consciousness. Others approached with cautious interest, suggesting new testing protocols or alternative explanations that might bridge conventional science with their unusual findings. What surprised Elena most was the reaction from religious leaders. She had expected resistance or claims of sacrilege. Instead, many embraced the research, seeing it as scientific validation of ancient beliefs about the soul's journey after death. "Your work doesn't threaten faith," a Buddhist monk told her during a panel discussion. "It creates a new language through which science and spirituality might finally speak to each other." Back at the institute, the team expanded their research. With additional funding pouring in from universities and private donors, they developed more sophisticated monitoring equipment. The new sensors could detect even subtler energy changes and had better storage capacity for long-term monitoring. Peter, who had been the most skeptical team member at the beginning, now worked with renewed purpose. He had developed a new algorithm that could better analyze the almost language patterns in the audio recordings. "I think I've got something," he told Elena one evening, his eyes bright with excitement. "Listen to this." He played an enhanced audio clip from Maria's coffin. The strange vibrations had been processed through his new algorithm, resulting in a pattern that sounded almost like words, not in any known language, but with definite syntax and repetition. "Now listen to this," Peter said, playing a recording of Maria speaking while she was alive, but with the pitch and tempo drastically altered. The similarity was undeniable. Something about Maria's unique speech patterns seemed preserved in those mysterious vibrations. "It's like," Elena struggled to find the right words. "Like they're still trying to communicate," Peter finished, "just in a way we're not equipped to understand." The implications were staggering. If consciousness continued after death in some form that could still attempt communication, everything humans thought they knew about death would need to be reconsidered. Dr. Lawrence Chen, the quantum physicist who had joined their research, developed a theoretical framework that might explain their findings. He called it consciousness quantum coherence, the idea that human awareness operated partly on a quantum level that could persist after biological death. "Think of the brain as a transceiver rather than the source of consciousness," he explained during a team meeting. "What if it's more like a radio that receives and processes consciousness rather than generating it? When the radio breaks, the broadcast doesn't stop. We just lose the device that was translating it into a form we could understand." Not everyone was enthused about their discoveries. A vocal group of traditional scientists launched a campaign to discredit their work, calling it pseudoscience and mysticism masquerading as research. Several prestigious journals rejected their papers without review. More concerning were the religious extremists who began camping outside the institute, some celebrating their work as proof of their particular beliefs, others condemning it as interference with divine mysteries not meant for human understanding. Elena had never wanted to be at the center of controversy. She was a scientist, not a revolutionary or a spiritual leader. Yet here she was, thrust into a role that combined all three. The pressure took its toll. Elena began having trouble sleeping, her mind constantly racing with implications and next steps for the research. One night, exhausted after a particularly difficult day of defending their work to a hostile panel of academic reviewers, she fell asleep at her desk. In her dreams, she found herself walking through a strange landscape. Not quite solid, more like moving through layers of light and sound. Ahead of her stood Thomas Whitfield, looking healthy and vibrant, nothing like the frail man she had known. "You found it," he said, his voice somehow both around and within her. "The pattern." Elena woke with a start, heart racing. The dream had been so vivid, so unlike her usual scattered dreams. She grabbed her notebook and quickly wrote down everything she could remember. The next morning, she shared the experience with her team, feeling slightly embarrassed. "My subconscious is obviously processing all this research," she said with a nervous laugh. "Maybe," said Diane, the neurologist, "or maybe there's more going on here than we understand." That afternoon, Claire Whitfield visited the institute, bringing more of her father's notes and journals. "I found these in his summer house," she explained, handing Elena a weathered box. "He spent his last summer there writing constantly. I think he wanted you to have these too." Inside the box, Elena found journals filled with equations, theoretical models, and philosophical musings about consciousness and quantum physics. Thomas Whitfield had been working on his own theory about death and consciousness transformation for years before volunteering for their study. Most shocking was a sealed envelope addressed to Elena, dated just 1 week before his death. Inside was a letter that made her hands tremble. "Dr. Mercer, if you're reading this, then my hypothesis was correct, and my death has become a doorway rather than an ending. What you're recording isn't just residual energy or random patterns. It's consciousness itself, transformed but intact. We don't die, Elena, we change." The letter continued, outlining specific frequencies and patterns to look for, many of which matched exactly what they had been recording from his coffin. It was as if he had known what they would find before they even began. "There's one more thing," Claire said, watching Elena's reaction to the letter. "My father asked to be exhumed after 6 months. He said by then you'd understand why." Elena looked up sharply. "Exhumed?" Claire nodded. "It's in his will. The 6 months mark is next week." The team spent the next several days in intense preparation. If Thomas Whitfield's body was going to be exhumed, they wanted to document every aspect of the process. New equipment was rushed in, protocols established. As Elena reviewed the original recordings from Thomas's coffin yet again, she noticed something they had overlooked. The patterns had been changing over time, evolving into something more complex, more structured. Whatever was happening wasn't static. It was developing, like a caterpillar in a cocoon. The night before the exhumation, Elena could barely contain her mixture of scientific excitement and personal dread. What would they find? What final message had Thomas Whitfield left for them to discover? Whatever awaited them tomorrow would change everything, not just for science, but for humanity's understanding of life, death, and what might lie beyond, the threshold between them. Dawn broke over the cemetery with a gentle mist hovering above the ground. Elena stood with her team and a small group of officials near Thomas Whitfield's grave. The atmosphere was tense, a mixture of scientific anticipation and somber respect. "Are you sure about this?" Peter whispered to Elena as the cemetery workers prepared their equipment. "Once we do this, there's no going back." Elena nodded, clutching Thomas's letter in her pocket. He wanted this. He planned for it. The exhumation process was slow and methodical. A tent had been erected around the gravesite to provide privacy and protect their equipment from the elements. As the workers carefully removed the soil, Elena's team monitored their instruments, recording every change in electromagnetic readings and temperature. "The signals are getting stronger," Diane reported, eyes fixed on her tablet. The readings had been steady for months, but now they were fluctuating wildly. "It's like something's responding to our presence." Finally, the coffin was visible. The cemetery workers stepped back, allowing Elena's team to take over. They had brought specialized equipment to document everything: cameras that could capture multiple light spectrums, advanced audio recorders, and sensors that could detect the slightest environmental changes. "Opening in 3, 2, 1, said the mortuary technician who had joined them for the procedure. The coffin lid was raised and everyone fell silent. What they saw defied explanation. Thomas Whitfield's body was largely as expected after 6 months. The natural processes of decomposition had taken their course. But surrounding the body was something none of them had anticipated: a fine, luminescent web of what looked like glowing filaments, almost too faint to see in the morning light. "Turn off the external lights," Elena whispered. As darkness fell inside the tent, the phenomenon became more visible: delicate strands of bluish-white light forming complex patterns throughout the coffin. "Is it some kind of fungus?" someone asked. Dr. Chen, the quantum physicist, shook his head. "Fungi don't emit light in these patterns, and they don't create electromagnetic fields like what we're recording." When samples were carefully collected, they discovered another mystery. The filaments, despite their appearance of physical substance, seemed to dissolve when touched, like trying to grab a beam of light. Yet their instruments registered them as having mass and energy. Inside the coffin, tucked beside Thomas's remains, they found another sealed container, a small metal box that their equipment hadn't detected because it was shielded. Inside was a data drive and another letter, this one dated the day before Thomas died. "The next phase begins now," the letter read. "The patterns you've recorded aren't just echoes, they're transformations. Consciousness doesn't end, it evolves." Back at the Institute, the team worked through the night analyzing their findings. The data drive contained Thomas's own research, decades of work on consciousness, quantum physics, and theoretical models of existence beyond biological life. "He knew," Elena said, poring over the files. "Somehow he knew exactly what we would find. The glowing filaments, when analyzed, showed properties that didn't fit any known biological or physical category. They emitted electromagnetic pulses, identical to the patterns they'd been recording from the coffin for months. Most astonishingly, when compared with Thomas's brain scans from when he was alive, the patterns showed a 91% correlation, too high to be coincidence." "It's like his consciousness created a new physical medium," Dr. Chen suggested, "something between energy and matter." The discovery went global within hours. News helicopters hovered near the Institute. Religious leaders and scientists clamored for interviews. Government officials arrived, concerned about the implications for everything from medical definitions of death to inheritance laws. Elena found herself thrust into the center of a storm. She was interviewed by major news networks, questioned by scientific committees, even invited to speak before religious congregations. Everyone wanted to know what it meant. Was this proof of life after death? Had they discovered the physical form of the soul? "We don't have those answers," Elena repeated in each interview. "What we have is evidence that consciousness might not end with biological death. It may transform into something else, something we're just beginning to understand." The other subjects in their study showed similar phenomena when examined, though with variations. Maria's coffin contained filaments that pulsed rapidly, matching her quick, energetic brain patterns in life. Robert's formed more structured, geometric patterns reflecting his methodical nature. As public interest exploded, so did the controversy. Traditional religious groups split between those who embraced the findings as scientific validation of the soul and those who condemned the research as blasphemous interference with sacred mysteries. The scientific community was equally divided, with many prestigious voices dismissing the work entirely. "This isn't science," declared Dr. Harold Williams, head of the National Academy of Sciences, in a blistering editorial. This is mysticism dressed up in scientific language. Consciousness is a product of the brain. When the brain dies, consciousness ends. Period. Yet for every critic, there were two more scientists intrigued by the possibilities. Research teams around the world began setting up similar studies, hoping to replicate and expand upon Elena's findings. Through it all, Elena struggled with the personal implications. She had begun this research seeking data, not revolution. Now she found herself questioning everything she had believed about life and death. One evening, 6 weeks after the exhumation, Elena sat alone in her office reviewing new data. The filament samples they had collected were continuing to evolve, becoming more complex in structure. Even more fascinating, they seemed to respond to stimuli, changing patterns when exposed to familiar music that Thomas had enjoyed, or when Claire spoke. Near them, the phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was Claire. "I found something else," she said without preamble. "Another letter from Dad. This one was hidden inside a puzzle box he made for me years ago. It was set to open automatically 6 months and 6 weeks after his death." "What does it say?" Elena asked, heart pounding. "It's complicated. I think you need to see this in person." An hour later, Claire sat across from Elena, sliding an envelope across the desk. Inside was a handwritten note and a small device that looked like a modified hearing aid. "He built this," Claire explained. "Said it would help translate the frequencies." The note was brief. "When consciousness transitions, it doesn't lose awareness. It gains a new perspective. This device won't let you hear everything, but it's a start. Sometimes you need to tune the radio to the right frequency." With trembling hands, Elena examined the device. It appeared to be a sophisticated frequency converter with neural feedback components, technology that was advanced but not impossible. Thomas had been a brilliant physicist after all. "Has anyone used it?" she asked. Claire shook her head. "Dad was clear. He wanted you to be the first." That night, after the rest of the team had gone home, Elena returned to the lab where they kept the filament samples. Following the instructions in Thomas's note, she calibrated the device and placed it in her ear. At first, there was nothing, just a faint static. Then, as she adjusted the settings as instructed, something changed. The static resolved into patterns, then into something that resembled words, though distant and distorted. Frequencies align. Consciousness expands. Not an ending. Elena froze. The voice was unmistakably Thomas Whitfield's. More to discover. Pathway opens both ways. She grabbed her recorder, hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. "Thomas," she whispered, "is that you?" The patterns shifted, becoming clearer for a moment. "Elena, keep going. This is just the beginning." Then the connection faded, leaving only static. Elena sat in stunned silence, the recorder still running. What had just happened? Was she hallucinating from exhaustion and stress? Had Thomas Whitfield somehow imprinted his consciousness into these strange filaments? Or was something even more profound occurring? She reached for her phone to call the team, then stopped. This discovery was too significant, too potentially disruptive to share without careful consideration. If consciousness could truly communicate, after death, the implications would shake the foundations of human understanding. Outside her lab window, the night sky was filled with stars, distant suns whose light continued to travel long after some of them had ceased to exist. Beginnings and endings, all part of the same cosmic story. Elena looked down at the recorder in her hand. Whatever they had discovered, whatever doors they had opened, there was no going back now. Humanity stood on the threshold of a new understanding, of existence itself. And somewhere, somehow, Thomas Whitfield was still part of the conversation. 1 year had passed since Elena first placed cameras in Thomas Whitfield's coffin. The world had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Elena stood at the podium of the newly established Consciousness Transition Research Center, looking out at faces filled with hope and curiosity. What had begun as her small team in a modest lab had grown into an international collaboration of scientists, philosophers, and theologians. The building around them, a gleaming structure of glass and sustainable materials, had been funded by donations from around the world, people eager to support work that might bridge the gap between life and what came after. A year ago, we took the first tentative steps into understanding what happens after biological death, Elena began. Today we stand at the threshold of a new frontier in human knowledge. Behind her, screens displayed their latest findings, the evolved filaments now observed in 28 different subjects, each with patterns that match the individual's brain activity during life. The communication technology, refined from Thomas's original device, had progressed to allow clearer, though still limited, reception of what they now called transition consciousness signals. The most stunning breakthrough had come 3 months earlier. Using a modified version of Thomas's device, they had discovered that the filaments didn't just receive communication, they could respond to it. The consciousness that continued after death wasn't just broadcasting, it was listening, reacting, evolving. What we've learned challenges every assumption about death being an ending, Elena continued. The evidence suggests that consciousness undergoes a transition, maintaining core patterns while adapting to a new state of being. After the presentation, Elena retreated to her office. The walls were covered with charts, equations, and photographs, a visual history of their extraordinary journey. On her desk sat a framed picture of the original team, taken just days before they had placed the first cameras in Thomas's coffin. They looked so young, so unaware of how their lives were about to change. Peter knocked on her open door. He had changed too. The skeptic had become one of their most dedicated researchers, especially after his mother had passed away and joined the study as their 15th subject. The new frequencies are coming in clearly, he said, handing her a tablet. We're getting coherent responses to almost 60% of our questions now. Elena scrolled through the data. The improvements were remarkable. What had begun as fragmented words and phrases had developed into more complex communications, still limited and often puzzling but undeniably meaningful. Have you listened to Maria's latest? Peter asked. Elena shook her head. Maria had been their second subject, the young mother with the brain tumor. Her transition consciousness had been particularly active from the beginning. Peter tapped the tablet, and a voice emerged, distorted and distant, but recognizably female. Not alone here. Others. Before your instruments. Always been a pathway. Humans forgot how to listen. Elena felt the familiar chill that still came with these communications. She's saying there were others before we started, recording that this has always been happening? Peter nodded. That's how I interpret it. And listen to this part from Thomas's latest session. Another voice, this one stronger. Consciousness is not created by the brain. Brain is a receiver and translator. Death is removing the filter, not ending the signal. The theory aligned with what Dr. Chen had proposed months ago, that the brain might be more like an antenna for consciousness rather than its source. If true, it would explain how patterns could continue after biological death. There's something else, Peter said, his voice dropping. Something we recorded last night from Robert. Robert had been their third subject, a retired engineer whose methodical mind had produced some of their clearest communications. The recording was different from the others, clearer, more urgent. The barrier thins, communication possible both ways. Prepare for more contact. We are learning too. Elena leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. They're getting better at communicating with us, just as we're getting better at hearing them. Exactly, Peter said. It's like two species learning each other's language for the first time. Later that evening, Elena met with Claire Whitfield at a quiet cafe near the center. In the year since Thomas's death, Claire had become not just a supporter of their research but an active participant, helping to refine the communication technology her father had begun. Dad would be amazed at how far you've come, Claire said, stirring her tea. Though I suspect he wouldn't be surprised. I think he knew more than he told us, Elena admitted. His journals predict almost everything we've discovered. Claire smiled. He always said death was just a door, not a wall. Now you're figuring out how to peek through the keyhole. Not just peek, Elena said. We might be learning how to open the door a crack. She shared their latest finding, that under certain conditions the filaments responded not just to questions but to emotions. When family members expressed love or shared memories near the samples, the activity increased dramatically. It was as if emotional connections created stronger bridges between states of consciousness. We're setting up a new phase of research, Elena explained, exploring whether conscious intention from our side can strengthen the signal from theirs. The project had been dubbed Bridge, and it would bring together families of the deceased subjects with the research team in a carefully controlled environment. Using the refined communication devices and new sensory equipment, they hoped to establish more meaningful exchanges. 2 weeks later, the Bridge project began. The room was designed for maximum comfort, soft lighting, comfortable seating, and state-of-the-art monitoring equipment disguised as ordinary furnishings. Elena wanted the participants to feel at ease, not like they were in a scientific experiment. The first session included Peter and his mother's filament sample, Claire and Thomas's sample, and 3 other families. Each person wore a modified version of Thomas's device, now streamlined to look like a simple earpiece. Remember, Elena told the group, this is new territory for all of us. We don't know exactly what to expect. Just speak naturally, share memories, ask questions if you wish. What happened next exceeded all their expectations. As families began speaking to their loved ones, the filaments pulsed with increased activity. The communications coming through the devices were stronger, more coherent than anything they had recorded before. Love doesn't end, came Thomas's voice to Claire, clearer than ever. Still here, still learning. Beauty, beyond what? I imagined. Peter's mother spoke of peace and continuity. Robert described experiencing multiple dimensions simultaneously. Maria spoke of being with others who had passed before her. Most significantly, they responded directly to questions, creating true exchanges rather than just broadcasts. When Claire asked her father if he was alone, he replied that consciousness after transition was both individual and connected, separate raindrops becoming part of the same ocean, while still remembering they had once been raindrops. As the session progressed, the participants reported another phenomenon, a sense of presence as if the room contained more than just the physically present individuals. Some described feeling gentle touches or sudden warmth. The monitoring equipment recorded fluctuations in the room's electromagnetic field that corresponded with these reports. By the end of that first Bridge session, something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer just research into what happened after death. It had become a doorway to actual communication between states of existence. In the months that followed, the Bridge project expanded. New techniques were developed. The communications became increasingly clear and complex. Consciousness that had transitioned began sharing perspectives and insights that challenged fundamental human concepts about reality, time, and existence itself. News of their breakthroughs spread worldwide. People who had lost loved ones traveled thousands of miles hoping to participate. Religious leaders debated the theological implications. Philosophers wrote new treatises on the nature of being. 1 year and 1 month after placing that first camera in Thomas Whitfield's coffin, Elena stood at her office window watching the sunset. On her desk lay the draft of a book she was writing, not just a scientific account of their discoveries, but a deeply personal journey from skepticism to wonder. Her phone buzzed with a message from Peter. You need to come see this. Something new is happening with the filaments. Elena smiled. Every day brought new questions, new mysteries to explore. Death, once the ultimate ending, had been revealed as perhaps just another beginning. As she gathered her things to return to the lab, she thought of Thomas Whitfield and his final gift to humanity. Not just his participation in their study, but his vision of what might lie beyond the threshold of death. He had given the world not just hope, but evidence that consciousness continued on its journey, transformed but undiminished. The greatest mystery of human existence had not been solved. It had only begun to unfold.